welcome to this public defense of the solicitation of Mr. Richard Lewis. The time is very, we have to follow the time very strict because of all these measures we have to take. So I propose to start, and I can give the floor first to Richard, who will entertain us during 20 minutes with a kind of synthesis of his research.
Okay. All right. Hello, thank you for being here or tuning in virtually. Exactly 4 years ago today, on the 11th of September 2016, I arrived in Brussels in order to begin my journey of this dissertation. This museum selfie bookends this process. My initial dissertation plan was to study the effects of media technologies on museum visitor experiences. 4 months into my study on the philosophy of technology, I decided to experience for myself how I was being affected by technology by participating in the annual museum selfie day that comes around every January. And while I did experience effects of technological mediation, I was surprised to discover that the biggest effect on me did not come from technology's influence, but through my own hyper-awareness of the many people around me and my own embarrassment and reticence to take selfies in the museum while others were watching. And this demonstrated to me that technological mediation is not the only relation that affects us when we use media technologies. I then focused my research to come up with an ability to better understand and situate to complex relations involved with the media we use on a daily basis. And this dissertation is the result. So, relating through ourselves, situating media literacy with intersubjective mediation. And this is a common scene we probably see often, where we have a group of people, and some people have mentioned there's an internet meme calling it that this is a zombie apocalypse, right? So everybody's walking around engaged with their media and less engaged with the world around them. But Cranford said that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So we might have some people who are passing time playing games. Some people might be just texting to each other and having a conversation that way. Some might be inviting or connecting with their loved ones back home who can't be with them and are experiencing their travels through Belgium. One might be a PhD student writing their dissertation on the phone, who knows? So what I wanted to do is situate media literacy. And this is the basic outline. I'll first look at media literacy, and then I'll talk about the technological medium itself. And then going beyond that, I'll start examining the context around it, how media technologies are embedded in a broader context. And finally, I'll look at the post-human subject, the contemporary version of the human subject and what that means. I chose media literacy because I was really interested in doing a PhD that wasn't only theoretical, but was also practical. I wanted, and media literacy with its focus on education really fit that bill for me. There's 4 common approaches, at least according to Kellner and Scher, for media literacy. The first approach is the literacy movement. So basically, media literacy is based off the general literacy movement that started to help us teach us to read and write. And then that movement really fragmented into a lot of smaller movements. We have digital literacy, we have algorithmic literacy, media literacy, information literacy, and all sorts of different literacies. Another approach for media literacy was the arts-based approach. And this approach focuses on educating how to use technology to give a creative outlet for your inner voice, to actually be creative with technology. So it's looking at teaching us how to use media technologies to create. Then there's the protectionist approach. And the protectionist approach is looking at, well, some involvement with media might not be positive, especially with young people. how can we potentially protect them from the influences, the negative influences of media? And then there's the critical approach to media literacy, and this looks at representation and discourse, especially of groups that might be marginalized. How does media represent them in the broader context? But for me, I wanted more than that, more than just the media literacy. I wanted this broader framework. And so I first started with looking at the technology itself. How does technology affect us? And there's a whole range of approaches to this. On one end, there's people who see technology as strictly in an instrumental way. So technology is an instrument. We still retain our agency. We have full agency. And technology just extends our abilities to do things. And this is really the arts-based approach to media literacy. There's arts-based approach doesn't have too much of a critical look at can not have the critical look at the technology itself. On the other end of the spectrum, there's this fear of losing our agency. And this is the deterministic approach. And this falls more closely to the protectionist approach for media literacy. And my approach and the approach I'm doing an interdisciplinary study and all the various fields that I looked at are all relational approaches. And they understand that there's a shared agency involved. It's not all on one end of the spectrum or the other. And my main field of study for this was post-phenomenology. And what post-phenomenology does is looks at technological mediation. And using this little formula, I technology world, and understanding that there's a co-constitution involved. That it's not looking at the I separate from the world or separate from technology, but once the I, technology, and world become in relationship with each other, they are all constituted at that moment. And this constitution, this effective technological mediation, has both enabling and constraining abilities. For me, for one of the key concepts I created in my dissertation was leveraging the aspect of one type of technological mediation, and that's the embodied relation, where we're looking at technology in an embodied way, such as eyeglasses. When I put them on, I'm not seeing or engaging with the technology, I'm engaging with the world through the technology. My focus is not on the glasses. And the glasses enable and constrain. These are reading glasses, so all of a sudden all of you are blurry now, but I can see my print quite well. So they're enabling and constraining. The second aspect is situating the context. Media is embedded in a broader context, and Silverstone and Morley developed domestication theory to look at how they were studying television, and they decided to look at how television was actually used in the home. And so where was the television set placed? How, when it was brought into the home, how did that affect the relation, the engagement between the families and with the television itself, and how did that change through time? And what happened was that these environments there's all these interrelations that are happening, and it was clearly that it became a very complex situation. And complexity is another key concept for my dissertation. That complex systems are open and they're in non-linear equilibrium, meaning small changes can have large effects if the system isn't very resilient, or large changes can have very little effects if the system is very resilient. And the interrelations in these systems, in these open systems, is always emerging. So there's never a single solution that you can have for an open system. And the last aspect is the post-human subject. And I studied philosophical post-humanism, which Ferrando describes as having kind of three major components. The first is that post-humanism is post-humanist. And it doesn't mean that it's anti-humanism, but it goes beyond the idea of rational humanism and that's tied with 18th century Enlightenment, these ideals of the standalone individual. The individual can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. There's an essential aspect of the human. It goes beyond that, and it also goes beyond this post-anthropocentric attitude, where the human is in the center of all things. And this human, for the post-humanist, the human is still in the system. They're just not in the center, and everything revolves around them. And the final is this idea of post-dualism or post-binary. So post-humanism tries to stay away from these various binaries, like technology is instrumental or technology is deterministic, trying to get away from these either-or relations. It really looks into the idea that we are human becomings more than human beings. Human beings have this more static, essentialist attitude. The idea of human becomings means that we're constantly being constituted by our technological and other relations. And I use this to develop my one main concept, which is called intrasubjective mediation. It just kind of rolls right off the tongue. I really don't need to say anything about it, it's so clear. But this came from this idea that Don Idy, in one of his books, wrote that technologies transform our experience of the world, and we, in turn, become transformed in this process. And the key part that he said was transformations are not neutral. So not only are we constituted in all of our relations, so I brought this, he was talking about technological relations, I say this for all relations that we're in, that the relations that we're in constitute us. We're transformed. But these transformations continue to transform how we engage with the world. So we perceive and engage the world through them, so we're constantly, again, becoming. This concept provides the ability to identify and foreground these major subject transformations. And again, I'm tailoring this to media literacy. And so what I wanted to do is to kind of create a fairly simple framework. If I'm looking at all the relations that create the human subject, all the relations that we have in this world, in our life world, how can we kind of tease that apart and identify those relations by groups? And it's important to note that these aren't categories, these aren't separations. So Fritjof Capra mentioned that in complexity, talking about boundaries of identity, not boundaries of separation. So all these different groups help contribute to our constitution. And I put a little framework together. First, there's bodily functions. So what is going on in my body? This is affecting me. This is constantly affecting me. My mind, where's my mind at? What am I doing with my imagination? There's time, temporal, and spatial relations, right? These are the first four dimensions of physics, time and space. So the past, how has the past influenced me, and what are the potential of the future, those ideas, how's that influencing me in space? Everything around me, whether it's natural, wild environment or construction, what have you. There's also sociocultural and technological relations. And many of these groupings are very general and they can have subgroups. So it might be relevant to look into, like in social cultural relations, power structures or issues of gender and identity and time, whether looking at the past or the future. I also wanted to put a placeholder because creating an all-inclusive framework, which was my attempt, I wanted to also put out there that we're fallible. I'm fallible. I cannot assume to be able to capture all the relations that affect us, that influence us. So I wanted to put in this idea that there's unknown and unknowable relations as well. So that's how the theory came about. And from there, I wanted to, okay, that's way up here, right? This is this broad picture. How can I take that and actually create an instrument that's practical and pragmatic for media literacy? And for me, I wanted to do this because by creating an instrument, it could provide a cartography, a map that can help situate any of our own relations, media relations. So going back to that museum selfie, I decided to take that one instance, this one museum selfie, and take my framework and look at each group of relations and try to analyze, try to come up with what are the relations that were happening at that moment. And so I started with the mind relations. And I just started writing down in this general grouping of relations what was going on. And so my mind was helping me see museum objects and imagine possible selfies. And as I was writing this down, I decided to, because some were influencing me more than others. So I had a very basic way of evaluating the amount of influence, 3 being a very, very high influence, 2 being medium, 1 being very little, and even some zeros that weren't influencing me at all. And then I did that for all the other groups of relations. And as I was putting this together, it started becoming clear to me that, well, actually, the space around me was affecting how I was seeing these possible museum selfies, and my body was also affecting this. So I was seeing these interrelations that were happening, and I didn't feel it was good enough to just to give the kind of what I was calling a direct relation. And so I expanded that, and I put the groups of relations over here again, and so that way I could say, okay, for each of these singular relations, singular, not very singular, that I wrote down, how it was affecting me, how are these other groups of relations, how was space, the space around me, the museum space around me, how was it affecting my ability to create a museum selfie using my imagination? And then I could relate that. And this way, it started demonstrating to me, identifying to me the complexity behind a singular museum selfie. What I felt gave me a better understanding of that. And because these were all numbers, and I'm a photographer, I like visuals, I decided to use, there's a software called Circos, and what I did is I plugged in all those numbers and their relations, and it gives a kind of a display of how they're interrelated. And I thought that would look good behind the museum selfie, just to kind of give us, to kind of undermine that sense that the singular selfie is a singular event and showing the complexity behind it. And this is mostly just for visual. So then, through prodding and inspiration through my promoters, I took the first steps to try to take what I did and create kind of a general instrument for media literacy. With the idea, what I was thinking is, maybe as university students, how would an instructor try to get university students who are studying media relations, how could they use this or tap into this? And this is a very initial step. And it would be very helpful to actually do this with a faculty and see what actually happens and change it. So the first is identify the media event. The media event is very important. What choices, what media events will work with this and what might not. Then have the students review the framework, review the 6 relations, and so they get an understanding of that. And potentially have a pre-assessment, maybe engage with the students and ask them, what do they think might happen, what the influence of the different relations. And then actually engage with the media event. And this is a very phenomenological approach where the student would engage with the event and really become aware, try to become aware of what was happening, what were the relations happening, potentially take notes during that. And then do kind of the process I followed, write down, reflect and write down, identify specific relations in each grouping. And then start to evaluate those relations and then the interrelations. And from there, they can step back and analyze it holistically. Does this make sense? And this is also where maybe the instructor might come in and have a teaching moment where, there's a whole other group of relations that they maybe didn't think about and potentially were affecting. So in conclusion, as I'm wrapping this up, All relations in our life world transform us through a continually emergent process. The relations can be gathered into loose groupings. Not all relations can be known or knowable. These relations interrelate, enhancing and constraining in complex, non-predictive ways. And by becoming aware of the complexity of influencing relations, we improve our ability to decide what media we invite into our lives. And just a final caveat, what Silverstone says, all concepts are metaphors. They stand in the place of the world, and in so doing, they mask as well as reveal it. And I just want to acknowledge the framework and instrument I developed do the same, enhance and constrain. And so always end with a lovely cartoon, go for complexity, and thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So now we have 15 minutes for every member of the commission. And it's usual to start with the colleague who lives furthest away from here. And in this case, it's very easy to make a choice. It's Professor Kelly Adams from Alberta University in Canada. Kathy, I hope you're there.
I am. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yeah.
Yep.
Excellent. Yes. May I begin?
Yes.
Yes.
Cannot see you, but we can hear.
Do you want me to try to project her?
Attempting that. Richard, I very much enjoyed reading and now hearing your presentation about your research. The document itself was very comprehensive and very well written, and I do look forward to referring my students to it, whether as a published book or as a series of articles. And I have 3 questions for you this afternoon. The first one is, in terms of philosophy of technology, I'm particularly interested in hearing you discuss how you see Heidegger's foundational ontology about being in the world, or we could even say becoming in the world, but more specifically, Vorhanden and Zuhanden, interacting with each of Don Idey's I-technology-world relations. And here I'm suggesting, for simplicity, if you could consider 2 technologies, the car and the speed bump. Would you like the other 2 questions now, and then you can go through?
Well, let me try to jump in really quickly for this first.
Okay.
That might be best.
Excellent.
So you want me to, okay. So Heidegger's, this comes up with the idea of transparency. So Heidegger's Zuhanden uses tools as they become transparent. So driving a car, when we first initially drive a car, we're very hypersensitive of the cars we're learning to drive. But once we learn to drive, the car recedes into the background, becomes more transparent, and is, as Heidegger says, it's Zuhanden, it's ready to hand. It's not really in our awareness. Unless the car breaks down, then all of a sudden it's a car again. It's Vorhanden, and it's present at hand, and we need to deal with it. It becomes known. And Don Idey, so he has 4 different relations, and I'll really talk about the first 3. So the embodied relation and hermeneutic relation, I feel, are more along the lines of that Zuhanden, that where the technology becomes transparent, we see, engage the world through the technology, so we're not doing so much as seeing. The one, and what Idey agreed with Heidegger, but felt that Heidegger limited between 2, either the technology is working and so it becomes transparent, or it's broken and becomes apparent. And I feel Idey teased that out a little bit more. And so looking at 4 different types of relations, and Idey's alterity relation is really that the technology doesn't disappear, because we treat the technology as an object, and we interact with object that way. That close to answering? I'm cognizant of the time. We only have 15 minutes.
Good. Can you quickly run through where the speed bump then fits into Don Ides? So I'm presuming then, so where would you put the speed bump then in Heidegger's Vorhanden, Zuhanden, and then in Don Ides' eye technology relations? Just quickly, it's fine.
Just quickly, okay. Yeah, I think that the speed bump would resist falling into the background, unless I would say unless it's right outside our we go over it every day, then I would say it could recede and be more of the Zuhanden. We don't really pay attention to it. We just slow down and go over it, and so it becomes kind of more transparent part of our life world, and it would, as far as I can tell, probably never get broken. Not might. Anyway, Don Ide would see that. It's a good question. Because, and I guess it's similar in answer, where it would be an embodied relation if we just automatically slow down at that point and go over it, rather than as we're driving and we see a new one, it would be we have to deal with that speed bump, and it affects us directly, and it doesn't really. I guess that's what I would say.
Okay, great, thank you. The other two questions I have are related to your instrument. So as you know, I'm a teacher educator, and for the most part, the young teachers that I interact with are highly practical people, in part because they're often extraordinarily busy people, not that we all aren't, but your instrument is quite complex and time-consuming. So I wonder if you thought about simplifying it, and if so, how? So that would be the first part of the question, and then I'll give you my last question, which is related. So regardless of whether it's simplified or not, but so a teacher uses the instrument for their own media literacy purposes. And what kinds of insights could they expect to discover through examining a media event in their classroom, for example? So would they be in a position to make any pedagogical decisions or modifications based on their observations? And again, I know that second question is particularly speculative, but I just wanted to hear what you might think with the team find it out for themselves, using it for their own media literacy purposes. So first one was about possibility of simplifying, and the second one is imagining a teacher using the instrument for themselves.
Right, thank you. Yes, I feel the next step is definitely simplifying. The instrument was developed really through my own kind of autoethnographic approach to what I experienced. And to make this reasonable even for university students, I believe it would need to be relanguaged. And there is, as you mentioned, there's so much in it that is quite complex. Unless it's common to use the phenomenological approaches in a class, you might not want to use that word at all, and just walk through ways of taking one or two steps in each of them. So especially, I think that the engagement part with the media event, and for me, this is, I'd say the best approach is if this could be spread out over many weeks. Maybe it's layered into a curriculum on media that other things are being taught at the same time, and maybe this is an instrument that can be overlaid with that and utilized step by step. And I think that insights that the instructor would have what I would hope is this idea of going about, when we study media literacy, going beyond just the media relations and seeing how interrelated our choices are as users of media, and how the media is influencing us, how the society, the cultural relations around us are influencing us. And for me, it's trying to get away from the simplified version when we teach media literacy, that's just this or that. And it would really need to be integrated into a class, understanding how long is the class, how many hours we have to devote to this, and really cherry pick what we wanted to leverage and teach at that moment. And of course, I would start at the university level, because I think there a lot of changes need to be made already just as we implement it, but then moving it into the more primary grade levels even more so.
Can I just follow up? So I really like what you're saying about by using the instrument, the teacher or students would then have a better handle on how the media is influencing them and how the society and how cultural relations around us are influencing us. Yet, just going back to your slide with the Captain Picard and the Borg, in what ways can we pull back our agency, I guess, if we understand how the media now is influencing us, yet what can we do about it? What kinds of decisions or actions could a teacher potentially take that, to counterbalance that? Or I'm just wondering what that awakening or understanding could potentially result in. Like, what do they do now that they see?
Right, and I see this really as a first step. For me, awareness is the first step. Education in media literacy is the first step. And then there's various ways of getting into more of the ethical decisions, the moral decisions of, well, what's right and wrong here. Technological mediation especially stays away from it, and the initial approach that I was following is quite descriptive. But it's critical that we also get then to that evaluative approach. But to start that, to get to that, I don't feel we can get right into and start talking about the norms and ethics of a situation without really understanding who and what we are. What are we as human beings? What is the process of our becoming? What is it through these relations that help create us? And then by understanding that and seeing the situation, then we can say, okay, now how do we want to be? Then we can actually make I'd say, more moral and normative decision making from that point.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I will pass the baton to my next colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alberto, are you there?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me, Alberto?
Yes,
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. And
Can you see me as well?
please, you have your 15 minutes questions and
Well,
comments.
you can just hear me. That's fine. No, that's fine. Okay, I have a comment, and my comment is going to be structured in two parts. First of all, I'm going to introduce a general first of all, I'm going to make a general comment about Richard's dissertation. While in the second part, I'm going to ask Richard 3 questions about the dissertation. So I would like to start, as I said, in the general comment about Richard's dissertation. And well, I have the impression that at the core of his work, there is a certain dissatisfaction for the current status of the philosophy of technology. For the past 25 years or so, philosophy of technology has been stuck in what has been called its empirical. First, the empirical term must be understood as a turning away from the transcendentalism that characterized the philosophy of technology of authors like Heidegger or Jacques Ellul. Second, the empirical term must be understood as an attention to specificities of single technologies, their design, social aspects, and so on. For instance, post-phenomenology, an approach in philosophy of technology Richard demonstrates to be very familiar with, is concerned with the description, and I would like to stress here the word description, of the technological mediation that characterize our daily dealing with the world. Philosophers of technology often work today in strict collaboration with engineers, computer scientists, and so on. Now, Richard's dissatisfaction is somehow twofold. First of all, I would say that he seems aware that with its empirical term, philosophy of technology has ended up throwing the baby with the bathwater. Indeed, the focus on the micro, that is the multiple technological materialities and mediation, has somehow brought philosophy of technology to neglect the bigger picture. Richard's dissertation represents in this respect, and I'm very sorry for the sentence I'm going to use here, an attempt to make philosophy of technology great again. So Richard is not victim of a grandiose delusion, of course. He's just aware of the fact that technological relations are always entangled with other sort of relations, and that any philosophical honest reflection about technological relations cannot underestimate this fact. So one could say that Richard's ultimate effort consists in giving us the instruments to orient ourselves at least a little bit in the complex network of relations in which the technologically mediated human world relations are embedded. I would also like to insist on the fact that Richard is not simply dismissing the efforts that have been done by philosophers of technology after the empirical term. He rather seems to propose to articulate them with his broader perspective. In other words, he's less turning away from the empirical term than trying to integrate it with a more transcendental perspective. One should not forget, however, that Richard's transcendentalism is an empirical transcendentalism. That is, a transcendentalism that is both domesticated and applied to a specific context. Well, the second kind of dissatisfaction is related, I believe, to the general lack of engagement that often characterizes the contemporary philosophy of technology. Post-phenomenology, for instance, at least in its classic version, limits itself to describe the technological mediation without really considering the possibility of criticizing or prescribing different mediations. Neither is post-phenomenology much interested into the consequences of technological mediations on the processes of subjectivation. This latter is instead a very important aspect of Richard's work. Moreover, I have the impression that Richard is much concerned with offering the outlines of a theory that may be useful for a practice, and more specifically to the general improvement in terms of media literacy among the population. In other words, in Richard's work, there is a strong anthropological and social commitment. Well, so after this general comment and praise, I would like to enter more in the details and of course in the criticism as well. So my first concern about regards the articulation in the first part of Richard's dissertation of so many different perspectives: media literacy, post-phenomenology, media ecology, trans and post-humanism. I fully understand the meaning of these choices. Media literacy is the object or the case study. Post-phenomenology represents somehow the status of the current debate in the philosophy of technology. Media ecology offers the opportunities to broaden the perspective. Finally, trans and post-humanism paved the way to the issue of subjectivation. Yet, reading the dissertation, one could have the impression to be before a rather eccentric effort of syncretism. I'm not saying that Richard should have chosen one of these approaches. The major point of Richard's work is precisely that these approaches need each other. But probably he could have done a more considerable effort to justify the passage from one literature to the other. The impression of syncretism continues in the second part of the dissertation, in particular when Richard introduces the list of relations in chapter 6, mind, body, time, space, social cultural technology. I said before that Richard's transcendentalism is an empirical transcendentalism, in the sense that he is not content with declaring that there are multiple relations that should be considered, but he also makes the effort to describe them. However, a double question arises here. First, why these 6, and precisely these 6 relations? Are we sure that this list is complete? Are we sure that each of these elements deserves to be considered apart? In the end, isn't each list still a limitation, domestication, and hence imprecise account of the multiple relations between the human and the world? I fully understand that Richard is here between the Schiller of empiricism and the characteristics of transcendentalism. He clearly chooses a third, medium path, but he should have probably taken care of better reflecting on the risks related to it with it. Well, the second question, which concerns this aspect, concerns each of the elements of the list Richard proposes. Isn't each of these elements so vast that it would deserve a dislocation apart? For instance, I was rather surprised by Richard's decision to put social and cultural relations under the same very general category of social culture. One can suppose indeed that in each culture there are different social groups, and different social groups have different concepts about the same technology. The fact is that Richard's goal is vast, maybe too vast for a single dissertation. His work looks more like a programmatic text for a new research program, in Lakatos terms, than a dissertation devoted to a specific issue. Media literacy is just the occasion to bring forward the current limits of many approaches to technology, but the path Richard suggests implies an infinite task that even an entire research unit could not accomplish in a reasonable amount of time. My second criticism, so that was my first criticism. My second criticism dissertation concerns a sort of implicit contradiction I see between the first and second part of it. In chapter 4, Richard pleads for a post-human attitude towards the subject. Now, I'm not very familiar with the post-humanist literature, but I'm rather familiar with the criticism of anthropocentrism and subjectivism that characterized the French thought, especially in the second half of the 20th century. If I'm not wrong, post-humanism has borrowed a lot from these earlier reflections, in particular from Foucault. Now, for Foucault, every self-constitution of the subject is always already an hetero-constitution of the subject. Even in his last courses at the Collège de France, when he got more and more interested in the way subjects subjectivize themselves, he believed that, and I'm quoting here an interview he delivered in 1984, these practices of the self are nevertheless not something that individual invents by himself. They are patterns that he finds in his culture, and which are proposed, suggested, and imposed on him by his culture, his society, and his social group. Now, my question is, how can this perspective be articulated with an autobiographic approach, a sort of autoethnography, such as the one Richard proposes in chapter 6, when he presents his instrument? How can the subject be considered able to account for themselves and their own action, impressions, influences, when subjects are never at their own place, like it is suggested, it seems to me, in posthumanism? Well, there are two kinds of replies to this issue, and Richard should consider each of them in his future researches. The first one is the one of those like Pierre Bourdieu, who insisted on the fact that social subjects are not the most entitled to account for their own actions. Think of his notion of biographic illusion. The second one is the one of other French sociologists, such as Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot, who, precisely against Bourdieu, recognize a certain legitimacy to social actors' autobiographies and self-understanding. and argued that the role of institutions might precisely consist in empowering individuals in their capability to narratively account for themselves. However, it is important to notice that such perspective implies a certain, however minimal and partial, rehabilitation of the autonomy of the subject that might contradict some of the assumptions of posthumanism. I have a third quick remark about Richard's dissertation. At page 125, he presents the formula for an inclusive intersubjective mediation. The relations are multiple, and as a consequence, the subject is constituted by multiple relations as well. Well, one could criticize the idea that the external mediation are exactly the same that one can find in the subject, but this is not the main point here. My question is rather why, in the scheme Richard offers, the word is still monolithic. Why isn't the word as well composed by multiple elements? And the question here is, would these constitutive elements of the word be different? Is there an alien dimension of the word that is partially inaccessible, but still is supposed to be respected and considered? In other terms, isn't Richard's dissertation, which does not consider the word and its multiple non-human relations, still anthropocentric? What a terrestrial term, the terrestrial term has been introduced in a special issue of the journal Technique in 2017, might add to richer theoretical perspective and more deeply to the philosophy of technology? Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard,
How many minutes?
you have 9 minutes left, so thank you, Alberto, for this wonderful expose.
Okay, thank you, Alberto. I found that the diagram that you were mentioning with the intersubjective mediation, present relations, and the world all by itself. And when you mentioned this in the internal defense, it really got me thinking. So I'm going to work backwards through the questions. I can keep them all in my head. And I think you're quite right about this. That and this is also so this framework, the I technology world relation formula, was from post-phenomenology. And post-phenomenology very rarely, at least I've seen a couple articles, but besides that, hasn't really dealt with the world. And so it leaves the world all out here on us. Oops, I didn't want to do that. Oh, phew. Leaves the world out there by itself. And when we mentioned this, I really started thinking about that. And I thought, well, so do I want to put replica once again of the different relations under the world, mind, body, space, time, technology, and culture? That just seemed artificial. And I'm leaning towards, to answer your question right now, that getting rid of the world altogether, that the world is our interrelationality with it. Now this is just this is my first reaction to thinking of, is there anything outside of all these relations that so for me, I wanted to create an inclusive framework that captured all relations, including relations that we don't even know about. And I don't, at this point in time, at this kind of just initial thought process, I'm not sure we need the world. We can say that we are intersubjectively mediated beings in interrelations with the world. That these are interrelations, right? They're all combined. So that would be my response to the world. But I think more conversations need to take place in Alberta. We might talk in the future. Trying to remember the second part of when you mentioned, is there a contradiction between the first half and the second half of my theory and my kind of empirical practical aspect of creating the framework and relationality? and the idea of the subject, going back to Foucault saying that even the technology of the self is still influenced so much by culture, and not the self themselves. I feel, and the idea is, isn't this an illusion that the self can actually take this instrument and analyze their relations and have this valid idea of themselves? And for me, I feel it comes down to, I created a framework and instrument in order to undermine this aspect that the self can know the self, or can be this essential self, and in a way so that the subject can actually begin to understand and become aware of these relations that they are a part of, that they're being influenced by. And I firmly feel that we do have agency, that my dissertation is not one where I'm stepping outside and trying to look into the world or into the subject, that I'm going from within, and what do we have at our disposal? And I feel at our disposal, by using the instrument and framework, we can better understand the limited amount of agency that we have, and understand the agency of technologies themselves, of cultural and power relations themselves, of what our whole history that happened in the past continues to happen, the relations between the natural world, our place, and how all these tie together. So I feel that I'm hesitant to say empirical transcendentalism, but that's, I think, one of the things I was kind of going for, is this mixture of trying to keep it all. But I might take that back, especially with people crying outrage, especially philosophers. That you can't do that. But the idea of yes, getting away from the empirical turn. When the empirical turn happened in philosophy of technology, and Dominic Smith mentioned this quite well, he says it was a turn, in essence, it was a turn away from the transcendental. And there's, I think, many of us who are starting to say now that that's not right, that we need both. And I'm trying to think of another aspect that you mentioned.
You have 2 minutes.
I have 2 minutes. Alberto, do you have a quick, point me in a direction that you want me to answer something?
Well, maybe the fact, yeah, the idea, why 6 elements, not more, not less? Just
great. That's simply, this was a long time in coming to come up with these 6 elements, and it was many iterations of this. And for me, it was, again, I have to stress that these are not categories, these are not separate groupings, but they are groups of identity that we can start investigating, and we need to keep in mind that these groups are interrelated. And so you don't have a standalone relation anywhere. But it's for me, it's a way that I can start looking. We need language. We need language to help our thinking process and to investigate. And by using these terms, I can say, and this is why I made a very broad social cultural. Yes, there's all sorts of subgroups within there. And I feel that this instrument and framework can be taken beyond media literacy, and other groups, especially in the social sciences, could use this and say, okay, well, yes, I'm specifically looking at gender relations. And so my focus will be that, but let me situate it with these other broad categories of relations and seeing how they might interrelate.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And I apologize, I forgot to introduce our previous guest, who was Alberto Romele from the University of Lille in France. Our next speaker is Professor Klaes, Laurence Klaes from
Thank you. I will be a bit shorter because I'm also known not to always use a lot of words. So one of my questions was already a bit answered by the first speaker who asked a bit the same question about your instrument. But still, I want to say I was really happy to read your doctoral thesis, especially because it's interdisciplinary work. And I think it's still very courageous to write an interdisciplinary thesis, although we are already in 2020 and a lot of people talk about interdisciplinarity, but you really try to do it, to combine philosophy with social science, but also with pedagogy, and to try to make an instrument. I think it's a huge work that you try to do, and I really loved reading it, and I think more people should try to make these boundaries between the disciplines. It made me again also aware that philosophy is still of huge importance for other disciplines, to nourish them, to help them create new frameworks. But one of the challenges of this interdisciplinary thesis is finding this equilibrium between different disciplines. So I had a question on this one, but on the instrument more concretely, but I will give another question more broadly. You answer it if you have time. I really would like to know what for you was the biggest challenge writing this type of PhD, combining these different disciplines. Because I think we all can learn from it to do it in a better way or another way. Because you try to make an actionable framework or instrument, but you combine it with really a lot of theory and philosophical thoughts, and how did you do it, and how do you think we should do it more? But the focus of my question is on technology itself. You start with a huge focus on technology and mediation, and the role that technology plays in this mediation. You go to cyborgs, and you go to Rosie Braidotti and a lot of other authors who have been publishing about this since a long time. And you say that technology is non-neutral and multi-stable, and that you put also a lot of focus on the awareness about having agency around the relations with technology or how it interrelates in our life. But then in the instrument, I was wondering, you don't put so much focus on this technology itself, or the materiality of technology. So if I looked into the questions of your instrument related to technology, I thought, okay, where are we going now? You start with technology, and then you put, in fact, not so much focus on technology anymore. When you broaden your framework, for me, it's a bit going away, especially the aspect of agency and awareness. So I was wondering, how comes is this a chosen path, or how do you explain that you go from Don-Ide and then to a very broad framework, where you try to capture a lot of other aspects? And then I was also thinking, like, yes, with this intersubjective mediating framework, in fact, you create an ontological view on everyday life, and then it made me think about Alfred Schutz and the way he creates his ontological structure of the everyday life. It's sociology, it's still another discipline, I know. And there he also talks about spatial arrangements, temporal arrangements, social arrangements, minds, zone of relevance, biography of moments, personal stock of knowledge, and all the things that constitute your relations and your experiences in life. So then I was wondering, why didn't you choose such a framework, an existing framework, and try to extend it with this technological level?
Okay, thank you. Let me start again and go and work backwards to those. When you mentioned Schutz, it's my first reaction was fear, because it's like, okay, you did this whole framework and, well, it's already been done. Why didn't you use this? And so as a researcher, but it's actually quite exciting also that I never ran across his work And so as I'm preparing to put this into book form, I'll delve more deeply into his writings and this, like the structures of the life world. It seemed with Luckman seemed relevant in that. And I know your own dissertation brought in actually a simplified version, which I found very helpful, though I was having to translate it from English to understand. But and so yeah, basically I just never came across that other framework, but I feel I can leverage that now, going back to it. And it's also nice that it's supporting what I came to through my own process. So organically, something which again, this I have reams of paper of different kind of ways of diagramming and what type, mixing groups together. So that will be a benefit. The idea of agency of technology, so this is, and this is big in post-phenomenology, the idea, which is what Don Heidi says, is philosophers need to be at the forefront of the design of these technologies in order to have the most influence. So it's critical that we get more involved with the design. And I spent the chapter 3 mostly about technological relations and filling that out. And so I felt when I got to my instrument, you're right, I didn't come back too much with the technology. Simply, I didn't want to repeat a lot of the things or say the same thing in a different way to quantify it. But I can also look into it, especially I think the design is an important factor in the creative part. And my biggest challenge in this, it's the idea of everything always enabling and constraining. So one of my bigger constraints is I wasn't a funded researcher. What that enabled was me to do whatever interested me. And it was quite brilliant. It was, for me, I was able to pursue what I was most interested in and kind of follow the research wherever it went without any strict parameters that, okay, you have to do this research within these boundaries of this funding agency. And so it was academically a huge benefit to me. Other things, it was a detriment, but and you're right. So and this is feedback from my promoters as well, wondering where I was going next, going from one place to another, and it was quite interesting at the end to see that I actually cycled all the way back to that museum selfie. That I can look back and say, oh, what I needed was a new methodology to understand this, and I didn't see one out there. Maybe should have had that, and if I'd run across that, it would have either saved me a lot of time, or I could have then just extended his work. But it was only in retrospect that I kind of saw my trail as I went in, and it was really following the ideas of, well, to understand technology or to understand media, I needed to understand the effects of the medium. And to understand the effects of the medium, I needed to understand how it's embedded in, because it's not just the medium. And then it really came upon, what are we as humans? What is this idea of human subjectivity? And that was kind of the source of the founding kernel that I needed to figure out, and then to put it all together. So part of it is keeping the faith and just moving forward and being really excited about this, because it seemed the whole time very interesting. The 17 months of actual writing it, that was a little painful, but the excitement of this idea that I hadn't ever come across, this idea that we're mediated by these transformations, and I couldn't find a way. I mean, I started off talking about this is a technological sense that we develop, right? And it was only until, and I did conference presentations on this and technological days, it was another, and it finally came across, and it ended up to be this finally finished. Do you want to do any follow-ups? We might have another minute or two.
We have 5 or 6 minutes left. So. Any other questions? Excellent. Thank you. Next, we have the co-promoter and promoter who each have 10 minutes for their questions and ask you perhaps some minutes. You can start with Professor Bowers from the.
Hi, Richard. Dear Richard, congratulations on your work. 4 years on the dot since you arrived in Brussels, and today you clearly demonstrate that your motivation, determination, and eagerness have paid. So I'm very happy to see you here today. I truly believe that your interdisciplinary exploration of post-phenomenology, post-humanism, and media ecology provides a very original and relevant contribution to the field of media literacy, which I'm more familiar with than the philosophical theories that you explored in your thesis. And I truly believe that your contribution is less instrumentalist, although you developed an instrument in your approach. Now, your research and your key argument in your thesis, they challenge and bolster the theoretical foundations of the media literacy field. So I think that it's really important, and I hope that you will publish your ideas on this in an article, because it will definitely have a shock effect on media literacy, I'm sure about that. Great achievement, your interdisciplinary endeavor. It's challenging, it's daring, it's risky, so as co-supervisor, I'm truly proud of you. If I'm being honest, and you already hinted at it, I sometimes felt a little lost on your journeys, philosophy of technology and complexity theory. But when you were presenting your ideas for CENESO, which is our research group, you convinced me, first of all, that you actually understood what you were reading. 2, that you were able to explain clearly to a bunch of media and communication scholars what these theories are about, and I think that we now all understand what it means, phenomenology and so on. And 3, also you were able to successfully apply these theories on media literacy in a well-written, bold, and inspiring doctoral thesis. So I think that you are a critical thinker, a very good speaker, excellent presentation, and didactical skills. So your new employer, the Université de Lille, is very lucky to have you. Besides this more on a personal note, we have got to know you as a wonderful CENESO colleague. We will miss you. I was not always joining you for lunch, but a few times I did. I learned about your passion for typewriters, as you can see, and why you dislike iceberg salad. I enjoyed your stories about the US, giving me more insight in your homeland, which I only know from films, television shows, and news. You brought marieke and yoga in our work lives. Many colleagues will agree with me that this has saved us from work and publication and PhD-related stress and from horribly written papers. So thank you for that. We will miss your presence at the office, your humor, your warm personality, the calm. And even when you're angry about something, such as critical comments from your supervisors, you remain calm. So that's really nice. Speaking about critical comments, of course, we heard already some critical ideas, also some suggestions. Obviously, on some points, improvement is possible, that you know. I think there are weaknesses, blind spots, gaps. Some of them have already been pointed out by the other jury members. You should take them seriously into account when moving on to a further stage in your academic career. Also, when it comes to media literacy, you already discussed the small part of the media literacy literature. So when you decide to publish on it, you should read more on the topic, since it has evolved enormously last 10 years, and actually the framework you used is a little bit dated, but I understand it is interdisciplinary, so you could not delve into it too deeply. I have one major critical comment, and I would like to present to you today. Concerns, you already know it. It's like a field of tension or a paradox I can feel. I experienced this in reading your thesis. And when I was deconstructing your main argument, I thought, yeah, on one hand, you start from a very media-centric position. You set out your research by accentuating the centrality of IT, digital media technologies in our lives. As you put it, they act upon us all the time. And you seem to suggest that there is simply no escape anymore from these technologies. That's what I read in the lines, sometimes very explicitly. They are everywhere, always. Very media-centric point of departure. You make media centrality prominent, actually, in your analysis of everyday life, social life, and Western culture. Although there are still people who say, especially in sociology, that media is not everything in our life. That we do a lot of things next to using media and engaging with media. But on the other hand, the approach and remedy you propose is actually non-media centric. And you seem to suggest that in order to develop awareness about the role of digital technologies in our life, we need to see them just as one of the many factors that act on us. So the question that I have is the following. Does your non-media centric approach to media literacy not run the risk of playing down the effects of media and thus undermining your starting point, and maybe also the relevance, importance, and urgency of media literacy? Or do you think that this is not an area of tension, it is not a paradox, and then maybe you can explain this to me?
Thank you, Jurka. Yes, that is an area of tension, and I feel you're quite right in that I play down. I don't then come completely back around to potentially focus on that one topic of how our daily engagement with media technologies can affect us, and how we can specifically focus on that through the interrelationality of others. And that might be a place I can expand. I do feel when I was developing this, I severed my relationship, my media centricity, right, to really pay attention to, as broadly as possible, everything that was in my life world that was affecting me. And then when I stepped back and brought it back into the media literacy, analyzing the museum selfie, I feel, I'm just translating your point and admitting that I did it in a very maybe Latourian way, where everything was equal, right? And instead of potentially then giving media the primary role still in focus, and then tying in those, and that could be a beneficial way of doing that. But I do feel somewhat. I think when we talked about this, the non-media centric approach of yours and Morley, and how they felt that media literacy was getting very developed and specific and had its own literature, and it lost its connection to its roots, which were very interdisciplinary. So when media studies began, it was quite because it hadn't established. And they both made the points of feeling the benefit of kind of having a non-media centric focus, which is I felt that's what I I took that to heart. But I guess I didn't resonate with that one point, and that it could be possible. Because my instrument, I still kept, from my own point of view, my instrument as very inclusive and broad, feeling from the standpoint that it's not only media literacy that could be using this, that all social sciences could be using this. And I think that was my approach in that development, and that might have kept me from tying it more closely back to a very media-centric. Okay, now maybe one more, at least few pages in, let's be very media-centric and get to that point of using that, and then how can we then judge this and critique the effects of media as it's interconnected with these other issues. Okay.
Yes, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay. Maybe we can go back to the graph you made.
The graph, yes.
Since you said that, yeah, doing an exercise, you did it yourself, right? You also made roughly, yeah, maybe the next one.
The simple.
With you on the picture of you and the selfie, yeah, this one. Yeah.
Yes.
How would you judge based on that the effect of technology on yourself?
Right. You wouldn't. And that's why I tried to stress this as a visual, simply to support the complexity of the interrelationality. It's possible to, as you know the software, get to know the software more and more, potentially identify that the colors, certain colors meant certain things, this strength, and you can delve into it. I felt it wasn't necessary that to spend so much time learning a new software program, but I really liked it just as a visual way of an entry point into trying to understand the complexity behind a single point. But I think this works better just as a visual and not potentially more in the scientific, because if I wanted to do that, then I would have to then really explain the back end of the program and what were these meaning and why is it set up the way it is. And showing the differences of so language being very, very small, because it reflected, I had zeros throughout most of the language because I just really wasn't concentrating on semiotics or how language affects us. And I kind of acknowledged that, that's why it showed up very small, whereas norms is quite large.
But what we learned from this visual is that technology played a big role.
Right.
In this experience, in your selfies, in selfie experience. No?
Right.
Would
Yeah.
you say that on the basis of this?
I'd say this is directly tied to how it was happening over here. I think both technology and culture, everything has to. I mean, trying to split it up. I think this is, for me, this is a better way of getting into that. But that's just how my mind works, and because I created it, I'm in it quite deeply. And being able to then tease out, well, what do these numbers mean? Okay, so you can these are the general averages of, okay, so in general, summing up and averaging language had very minor influence on all the mind relations that happened. And there's ways of exploring this further.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay.
Thank you. Then I can give the floor to the promoter, colleague Joni van der Leden.
Dear Richard, so you're here. Not as Frodo says at the end of all things, rather, if anything, in the midst of things. but shortly at the end of a trajectory you've traversed with elegance, fervor, and resourcefulness. And instead of dropping the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, your quest now ends with the deposition of this impressive piece of academic work, completely singular in its approach and results, and in this way indelibly bearing the mark of its creator. At a moment like this, it behooves the supervisor to look back on the road traveled. I looked at the first emails we exchanged a little over 4 years ago. You contacted me out of the blue, looking for a supervisor in the area of media ecology, preferably in a francophone region, because you wanted to practice your French. I hope that worked out a bit. Usually I'm a bit cautious about such requests, but something must have clicked. Before we knew it, we were having lunch near the campus, and soon you were making plans to come over to Brussels and start work on your PhD in earnest. In one of those first emails you wrote, and I quote, "I have a very broad interest, and I am excited to jump in and really study as a scholar," end of quote. None of this was a lie. In fact, I didn't expect that this would be humorous. None of this was a lie, literally. In fact, this one line perfectly summarizes your style and work. Your broad interests became the eclectic melting pot, which is your dissertation. You've read voraciously in philosophy, media studies, complexity theory, media literacy. And because of your broad interests, an asset much more valuable than we would sometimes assume in academic circles, you were able to see lateral connections that otherwise go unnoticed. Jump in is truly what you did. Before long, you were going to conferences, not just visiting, but giving talks as well. As I can attest from the conferences where I was present myself, that was a sight to see. You were something of a fresh breeze at these gatherings, eager to learn, communicate, get to know people. Everyone loved you from the start with your disarming openness, curiosity, and not to forget, your humor. I still chuckle out loud when I remember that one presentation about museum selfies where you told the story about a person who wanted to take a selfie with an art sculpture behind her, and in trying to get a good frame for her picture, had gradually stepped backwards until she finally kicked over the expensive sculpture, shattering it into pieces. You mimicked the whole process by slowly receding toward the projection screen, all the while showing a picture of the still unbroken sculpture, and then when your back was right against the screen, acting like you bumped into something, and right at that moment, changing the slide to a picture of the broken pieces. I've never seen a conference audience burst out in such hilarious laughter. Really study as a scholar then. Also, those words were not in vain. You have been constantly engorged in books and papers and in writing. Motivating you to work was never a necessity. Granted, as these things go, we had our difficult moments in which you had your ideas about the direction you needed to go in, and I had ideas about the direction you needed to go in, and sometimes I communicated the latter all too clumsily and brashly. I hope I'm forgiven. You are my first PhD student, and although I know that cannot really count as justification, given that it was also your first PhD, we were both rookies. I am thankful you took it all in stride and allowed me to learn as well. I am also thankful to co-supervisor Joke for her ever-wise and calm guidance. For my part, I can say it was a pleasure and an honor to chart these waters together. Though I'm confident Richard will still be in touch, I will miss our talks about British rock band Supertramp, typewriters, as Joke also already mentioned, politics, family, life in general, and so much more. With Supertramp, I will say not goodbye stranger, but till next time friend, it's been nice, hope you find your paradise. It is my privilege at this point in time to say the last word about your dissertation and ask you a final question, that is not counting possible questions from the audience, of course. Once more, and like my colleagues, I'm impressed by the work you have produced. It speaks of erudition, of the capacity, notwithstanding that broad orientation, to engage deeply with literature, of lucid writing, and not in the least of original thinking, with the innovative concept of intersubjective mediation. See, it's not that hard to pronounce, as its pinnacle. The polyamorous marriage you brought about between post-phenomenology, trans and post-humanism, media literacy, and other fields is so smart and balanced. Each in your treatment comes to mutually complement each other's shortcomings. What you're trying to get at is really an everything literacy, while waging a fierce battle against reification. In a way, you holistify the embodiment relation of post-phenomenology. We are the world. And holism is one of the big strengths of your thesis, albeit that obviously in it also lies a threat. One cannot but select certain aspects of a subject matter, in this case our everyday engagement with media technologies, to focus on, while necessarily leaving out others, and this, paradoxically, must always partly undermine the sought-after holistic attitude. That said, I see no other way. Riffing off the Rushdie quote you use, there is no way to swallow the whole world. Yet certainly I agree we must strive. And as far as attempts to swallow the world go, I think yours is a heroic and meticulous one. I congratulate and commend you for it. This brings me to the end and to my question. You designed your combinatory framework as a correction to all too linear and instrumentalist cues in media literacy, in order to pierce through to the beyond of environmental aspects of the conditions of technology use. In that way, you inscribe yourself into the empirical transcendental debate in philosophy of technology, and Alberto already commented on that, and specifically the critique of one-sided instrumentalism. And also on your instrumentalism, already a couple of colleagues commented. Nevertheless, out of your pragmatic approach then emerges an instrument. Now, isn't there a tension in developing an instrument to counteract instrumentalism, or more precisely, however that instrument is further conceptualized, by merely calling it an instrument? Don't you risk remaining stuck in the productivity-oriented, functional, efficiency-obsessed vocabulary, still so dominant and rampant in our societal setup? And in that way, don't you risk surreptitiously consolidating the underlying biases?
Yes. Correct. Yes. The term instrument was, I'm quite reticent to frame it, and doing research in what you call a framework versus an instrument. And one of your comments previously was also what happens if the instrument just becomes so front and center and then becomes very important. That's all that's left. And the interconnections behind the underlying theories behind could drop by the wayside. And I think that is a challenge and a threat in media literacy, in teaching media literacy in courses where you have a very finite time with students, and be able to not only introduce new concepts, but to actually have the students engage. And if I don't see a lot of students probably falling in love with this instrument because there's kind of a chilling effect of the complexity behind it. But I think it's ready to be adapted. I feel this is the point it's getting to be. And I would always, it's trying to constantly keeping the connection, and this is all my life. I've always tried to keep these broad theories, what are the broad philosophies, and the tangible daily life world aspects of that. And we need both. We must have both to be in a balance, to be able to keep our equanimity in our relations, and so we're cognizant of, and we can kind of judge and gauge how are these relations that we're experiencing fit within these broader frameworks, and hopefully have some means. We don't need to be filling this out. Hopefully it becomes more second nature as something like this gets used. But in analyzing our in-world media relations, engagements with media. I think that's all I wanted to say about You want
So-
to follow up?
Just a brief follow-up. So what you're trying to say is, you believe it's possible to instrumentalize anti-instrumentalism? It's not a trick question.
But so it really gets to the point of the middle path, right? It's not instrumentalism, it's not determinism. And I'm using, because I'm using the term instrument, I'm linking that with an instrumental approach. And that's the danger of using an instrument. It becomes a kind of a hollow, non-critical way of analyzing something. It becomes very efficient, and it's like, oh, we're just reducing these to numbers. And for me, this instrument was less about the specific numbers than it was more about undermining our approach, or our singular approach to understanding media. And so for me, it's that tying it to the holism of our engagements. And I would love a different word than instrument. I didn't have the courage to call it a methodology, to go into that. I think that's too dangerous. I think potentially all this can begin as what Alberto was referring to. This could be very, very large, and whole areas could be designed around kind of this type of method, and then maybe it could turn into a methodology, but not at this point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, thank you, colleagues here and abroad. Thank you, Richard. There's time left for questions from the public.
Go ahead. I'm not afraid.
I have a question. I left my name out because of practical reasons, but there are no other questions, so nobody. Was that clear? So, Richard, you know my appreciation of your work. I can agree with all the positive comments, but I have one question. It's a rather large question. There's a similarity between your critique of humanist rationality and the critique you read from post-colonial thinkers, so the critique of Eurocentric thinking. So my question is, what does your work mean for non-Western cultures? I'm thinking of someone I met almost 30 years ago when I was a doctoral student myself. He came to a conference in Bordeaux, France. He came from Ivory Coast, and he told me, I'm here to learn what we have to avoid with technology in Africa. What do we have to teach to other cultures? What can they learn from your media literacy?
Right. Thank you. Yes, and I did frame my whole dissertation that my standpoint was coming from the Western European point. But I think you're absolutely right. It's a great question, and it got me thinking. And I was so issues thoughts like Ubuntu. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but this I am because we are. I find that other cultures could actually have more developed areas in these 6 groups. So potentially, what I was reflecting on your question, I was thinking potentially certain cultures have I would say more effective ways of integrating, of understanding, and being cognizant of these interrelations that are happening. But they potentially might have less on it, especially with the new technology, since new technology, especially disruptive technologies, maybe the question from your colleague exemplifies this. How then can we understand these new technologies that might be coming in to their culture? And so I'd say just an initial potential way that this could be used is in this holistic framework that I say for Western cultures, we're really trying to work out a lot of social relations that we have many challenges in that area, and that other cultures may not. But I think I haven't really come across any culture that has everything figured out yet. And for me, again, it's trying to give a way, a very general framework, and to investigate specifics, and then say, okay, if this is also this new technology, then potentially using the instrument and saying, well, how is this intra-relating with our positive social cultural relations we already have? How's it threatening our social cultural relations that we have? And potentially to hopefully make decisions on whether and that's the whole idea of this framework and instrument, is to then make decisions based upon this new awareness. What technologies do we invite into our lives? Or the technologies that are just in our lives, uninvited, how can we best engage with them to keep ourselves in the best balance as possible?
Really no questions?
Yeah.
Interesting, Carl. We have 4 minutes left.
So thank you, Richard. I will be standing up so we can hear it better. And I would like to join first.
Yeah.
So I would like to join my distinguished colleagues in the praises for your work and your person. We have known each other a little bit, maybe not enough, but still, I will also miss you when you're leaving this country for another beautiful city, that is. But, well, coming straight to the point then. So I have a philosophical question for you. I haven't read your thesis, and I would like to, so I guess my colleagues will be happy to learn their version.
I'm happy to send you.
Well, okay. I take that as a promise. But so my philosophical question is actually related to the scheme you're presenting there. So I can only speculate a little on what you're really trying to sell us here. And especially I was struck by the unknown or the unknowable. Well, if there's a difference between it. But my philosophical point of view is actually the question: what is your viewpoint, or what is the rationale for the viewpoint you have? If it's not, then it is all about human consciousness. So, I mean, however you look at instrumentalism or anti-instrumentalism, it could not be done without taking into account that human consciousness is all. There's nothing beyond it in terms of explaining our relation with an instrumental world. So I was just wondering, is that part of the unknown or the unknowable? So where does the human consciousness come from? Or what do you have in mind? I won't say more.
Well, maybe you'll say more after I try to respond.
No.
Yeah, I feel somewhat challenged by the statement "it's all human consciousness." So especially coming from a philosophical post-humanist, non-anthropocentric mentality. So there's two aspects. I personally don't have access to objective truth, and I don't feel any need to pursue these ideals. So it is my consciousness. This is what I have. This is what I have, my agency, my mind, myself, my own subjectivity, to figure out how to exist within this life world and to exist and to understand the life world as best as I can. Part of that, for me, is the acceptance that there are things outside of my consciousness. I mean, being conscious of animals doesn't mean I'm conscious of their consciousness of the world. And so I think from a philosophical post-human, I try to, I guess, de-emphasize that aspect of human consciousness is all. In a way, it's all I have. But without getting into some objective truth of the world and the universe, I guess I like this part of this unknown, unknowable, to keep me humble, if nothing else, that there's things I don't know, that there exists existences and consciousness outside my ability to understand. And to constantly be questioning and learning and being open to learning them, to move potentially the unknown, potentially can come over to the knowable. And this one is just the free-for-all saying there might be things that we just cannot until we potentially evolve into a different nirvana. We won't go there.
Thank you, Richard. So the Commission will now retreat for.
Oh, there's one question from the Zoom. The Zoom group.
Do we have time for?
We don't have.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll answer them personally.
Okay.
The Commission will retreat for deliberation and then come back with the results.
Can you tell us about the typewriter while they're deliberating? That was the question.
Yes, so while they're deliberating, I brought show and tell. So this is a Corona typewriter. So it's 101 years old. It's so.
Can you bring it closer to the webcam? Yeah, just the typewriter.
Just the typewriter?
Yeah. Can you teleport it?
Yes, so this piece of technology called a Corona typewriter, and it was created in 1919. So in that time, we had the Spanish flu going on, right? 1918, 1919 happening, and so it's, for me, again, this is a piece of technology that I'm fascinated with technology, and I love the ability to, that this 101 years and this still works. It needs to be cleaned up. I just recently got it. But it has a history, right? It's not just technology, it's the cultural stories behind it that are not just based in the past, but how is our current coronavirus influencing or changing our perspective on this machine. So we're always interpreting things differently. But so for me, and this is a 3-bank Corona typewriter. So each lever that goes up has actually 3 different symbols. And you have 2 different bars going, if you're going to do the figure or the capital letter. And this is a foldable typewriter. So it puts it in the box and becomes, so this can be yours. Yes, this call 1-800 on your television.
So it's a free Apple MacBook Air.
So part of the fascination for me and what typewriters did, my first typewriter was from a Brocante in Lahore, and it was looking into the tactility, the senses that are involved, and the understanding that I am a different writer when I write on my typewriter than on a computer keyboard. There's a chilling effect. When you type, it's imprinted, right? Every once in a while, I still go control, I try to copy it, try to save it, try to save my work by doing, my fingers still want to do that. My mind still the computer mine's still in my fingers. But because of that, if you've studied the extended mind theory, that what happens for me is in computers, we can cut and paste very easily. So we can just think through our fingers into the laptop. It's part of it. Our muscle right there. And but on the typewriter, there's a chilling effect because erasing, having a full sheet of paper, you make a mistake, you have to correct it there, or heaven forbid you remove it and then find a mistake and have to change it there. What happens for me is I could tell, I could feel my mind going out of the machine and back into my consciousness, and it had this chilling effect for me to think more clearly and put my thoughts together in a more complete manner. And my first typewriter was in Xerte, so then there was a whole nother thing of learning, trying to get my fingers and understanding and kind of the idea of transparency, right? It keeps that from happening because it was still very present at hand. I mean, ready.
And Xerte for the U.S. audience. Xerte for the U.S. audience.
Xerte for the U.S. So it's French-based, and so France and Belgium are the primary places that have. And so the QWERTY, Q-W-E-R-T-Y, up in the top left is A-Z-E-R-T-Y. And the craziest aspect of Xerte that I still can't understand is that they have a shift period. To make a period, you have to shift. That blows me away. That's absolutely inefficient. And yeah, anyway. Which started in the first Xerte, started around the early 1908, 1909, where they started. Any other questions? on. Next dissertation, all handwritten. I did have a chapter written on the typewriter in there, but it was recommended to get pulled. For a good reason, yes. It's because it was different. I guess so. Keeping a unified dissertation made it a stronger dissertation that I was studying. More questions? These are free questions because the jury's not here.
Okay, here's a question from Portland, Oregon.
Uh-oh.
From Pearl Labs.
Okay.
How can we reduce the tyranny of technology in our lives, ... space? It seems to demand more and more of our attention rather than receding into the background.
I hear the jury coming.
Oh, Saved by the Bell.
So that person, I can have a beer with them and talk about tyranny of technology.
Okay, that's been recorded, so make it so.
So I have to do this in Dutch, and that's a formal obligation. So I apologize for those. Dutch is not that good. Wij, rector van de Vrije Universiteit Brussel, verlenen na beslissing van de examencommissie aan Richard Lewis, geboren op 28 januari 1965, de academische graad van dokter in de interdisciplinaire studies, communicatiewetenschappen en filosofie. Wij kennen dit diploma toe conform de bepalingen van het decreet van 12 juni 1991 betreffende de universiteiten in de Vlaamse gemeenschap. So, my congratulations, Richard. You have succeeded. You are a doctor in philosophy in interdisciplinary studies. Always was not the most comfortable situation to work in, but I think it went well. It's an illustration of what media today can do and what are the problems with it, perhaps. But I think it was a nice reunion. My congratulations again. We cannot shake hands even. Also for Joni, my congratulations. Gefeliciteerd. Joni is ooit bij mij gepromoveerd. De eerste keer dat ik nu dat hij als promotor was. I give the last words to Richard.
Thank you, Tyler.
This is only a temporal one.
Okay.
That's something better.
I must put up the penguin. So, I think one of the main points of my dissertation was undermining this idea of the standalone individual. And I think this is, my dissertation really reflects is my understanding of this, that I didn't write this. You cannot write something like this alone. That this idea, I have a big issue against copyright, and to having to claim something that, oh, this is me as the owner of this knowledge that I put together. I'm the sole owner of that. It's absolutely incorrect. Every relation with every one of you has helped me in this and has changed what the result of this. Yoga, Yoni mentioned this, that your balance of criticism and support is so wonderful. I felt very accepted, and I just want to thank everything that you did to support me in this process. Yoni, and I feel I had like 5 minutes, so I feel I need to be sort of quick. Yoni, yes, our original conversation when I looked you up the media ecology and saw there's 2 media ecologists in Europe. You were one of them. The other one was one of my students already. So it was to find you and to finally sit down, have someone understand what I wanted to do, and without trying to struggle to. You had nothing but support for me, and yes, criticism, and we worked through that. And it was. I feel quite honored and to be your first student, as you were. This was my first dissertation, like you mentioned, and I couldn't have asked for better promoters. The balance between the two, and both of them supporting me in this work and challenging me to, because I am one who likes to get distracted and follow down shiny different topics. And well, this is important. This is important. This is important. And both of you very eloquently and strongly at times kept me from going too far down too many ways. The whole jury I learned much through, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to read this and to give me this feedback, as I do plan on publishing this as a book, and I will incorporate that. Thank you, Mark, for sharing. I want to thank Mark for putting up with me for editing, for doing yoga, for being there, for doing this crazy adventure, coming all the way over here. My family, of course, everybody out there in the virtual land, financial support, love, everything, encouragement, my children giving me permission to leave the country, flee. They were very encouraging, and I kind of wondered about that. But no, that was good. Thank you, Eli. My brother in Portland, who just asked a question, I'll get back to you. Thank you for existing. My colleagues, it's I think one of the interesting, one of the I think very nurturing thing for my writing was that this idea of this open office that we had up on the 4th floor in Samizo was brilliant. We weren't separate. We were working on things individually, but we were working as a community, and the collegiality of that, where we could come together, share at times, and seeing Silka and Lean and Anne-Sophie come before and present, like, oh, maybe I actually can do this. And of course, the Sandwich Club and the rest of the club is on your own. Who did I forget? Everybody, friends. I think, yes, I don't want to go on and on, but I don't feel I'm not an individual. I think that one of the terms I was coming across was this idea of interdividuality, which does not run off the tongue very well, not mine, but we're individuals. We're together with each other and not separate, and that's important. And thank you all for making this possible.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you all. Thank you, colleagues. I can close this session. There's no reception because the reason you know why. So perhaps there will be other possibilities to have drink or something. Thank you all for your presence and my congratulations again.
Thank you. I think all of us who are graduating during this time that can't really have receptions will hopefully next year at some point have a large communal gathering, and we can celebrate them after we're all vaccinated.
Okay, so closing the Zoom session. Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Mark. Congratulations.
Are you leaving?
Yeah. We take a screenshot of everybody. Bye. Bye. Love you all.
Oh, there we go. My thing was on mute.
Yeah, do you want to say hi to your dad?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I couldn't hear you.
Oh, those are the Zoom people. Just say hi to Eli. Ah.
Hi, Hey,
Hey, how's it going?
hey, going well. This was great.
Oh my gosh, it was awesome. I'm glad I got to see it.
We'll have to FaceTime here sometime.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and celebrate.
Yes. Hey!
Good job. Hey, Rich, good job.
Yeah, great job.
Wonderful. Yep. So does this mean you passed?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, what a
Great.
good feeling.
I didn't believe the Dutch version. I don't know.
Oh, this is great. You did so, it was wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. Texted. So who's there? Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Hey, thanks. Bye-bye.
Enjoy. Goodbye.
Celebrate.
Will.
Bye. Love ya.
Ah, ja, ja, wel, maar dan is